Hello. I did a video not too long ago, and then I see that the A6700 was a pretty popular camera that was talked about and is just announced. So everybody, all the YouTubers were talking about it. And of course, I wanted to give my two thoughts when it comes to a video perspective on the Sony A6700, which took a few years to finally come out. Now, my history with Sony cameras has been pretty much non-existent when it comes to using them, but I must admit that Sony cameras are one of the most used cameras out in the field when it comes to video productions. Now, I've been to a lot of weddings, filmed many of weddings myself. I've filmed a lot of events, and usually when I see those events, a lot of the videographers have Sony cameras. And what I've noticed more often than not is that they don't just have the full frame bodies from Sony. They'll have like a little A6600 or A6400 like handy just to film whatever they can too, because it's pretty lightweight and it's pretty tiny, but it gets the job done. So now you have the A6700 at about $1,500, and with all the new introductions, specs, and what this camera has got, from a video perspective, I'm going to tell you my opinion as to what I think of it in particular, and is there a better option out there. If you're new to this channel, definitely consider subscribing. I talk about cameras in sense of video and basically my opinion and what they can do for you. So if you're into that type of stuff, consider subscribing. Now, the A6700, from a spec perspective, because I have not used the camera, so I really can't tell you much about the ergonomics of what it's like to use it, but from what I hear, it's got a deeper grip, it's got a flip screen, and it's really kind of like finally the jump that that camera series has needed to have. So it's not technically considered Sony's flagship APS-C camera, but at least for right now it is. Just like the R3 is Canon's flagship that is in denial until the R1 comes out, right? Now, when going over the video specs, the A6700 records up to 4K 120 with a crop, and then 4K 60 and 4K 30 it records with no crop on the APS-C sensor. So technically the sensor is a crop sensor, so you still have a 1.5 times crop when compared to full frame, but it records pretty well. And it also has Sony's new autofocus modes, and it's pretty decent job when it comes to recording video. Now, it does have a little bit of rolling shutter that is noticeable when recording in the higher resolution modes such as the 4K, but it's still a pretty handy recorder with great autofocus, so that's not really a problem. And the fact that the camera has a flip screen and it has an electronic shoe so that you can actually attach wireless microphones that communicate with the camera directly through the hot shoe, that's perfect. So on the photography side, it's a 26 megapixel sensor, and it captures 11 frames per second electronic and 11 frames per second with the active shutter. Now, from that standpoint, that's kind of, it almost makes electronic shutter pointless unless you really need to be silent. And because the rolling shutter is so bad on that camera, you probably never want to use the electronic shutter, so it's like pointless to have it. But it's nice that it's still there. And from a video perspective, the camera isn't really that impressive, to be totally honest. The battery life is pretty decent, but other than that, this is kind of a standard camera for $1,500 that I honestly don't recommend. And even the EVF and the LCD screen on it are so poor quality, and the resolution is so low and poor that it doesn't really represent what you're actually capturing when you take it into the computer and see what your results actually are, which is a real downside, especially if you're recording video and you want to use manual focus and pull focus and make sure that everything's in line. You'd have to use assist tools, and you really can't depend on that screen to know whether you have a high quality image or not, unfortunately. Now, when comparing that option, the A6700, to something that you can get as a different option, I would almost recommend the Fujifilm X-S20, which records internally 6K, and you can output RAW into an Atomos Ninja so that you can get actually 6K RAW recorded externally through ProRes RAW. And you also have modes where you can record slow motion in 1080, 4K 60, and it's a solid camera at $1,300 as opposed to Sony's $1,500. Now yes, Fujifilm has great colors and actually what you film with it is great, and it doesn't have Sony's unbelievable autofocus, but it's still a pretty decent buy with high resolution, great looking footage at a cheaper price with the same sensor size. So why go for Sony? Well, I'd say you could go for Sony if you're already in the Sony family of lenses and you just want to kind of stay in that ballpark. But if this is your first camera, you do have other options at comparable prices. Also, the R7 exists from Canon that does have a lot better features when it comes to photography. And I'll go old school for a second when it comes to that technology because it almost doesn't seem to be winning or comparing. This camera here is, at this point, like almost 8 years old. APS-C 29 megapixels, can record 4K 30 because again this is 8-year-old camera, but I'm going to take 28 megapixel pictures with it in RAW and watch this. I don't know if you heard that, but that's 15 frames per second. 15 frames per second. And that was with a shutter. That's not an electronic shutter. So you have Sony coming out with something in 2023 that is one SD card slot only, and it's only doing 11 frames per second, when this camera 8 years ago, 29 megapixels, is doing 15 frames per second with an active shutter. Sometimes when things go ahead, other things don't. So when you hear that specs are out and specs look amazing, you can always look at something older that might have done something better a long time ago. And yes, this is APS-C, 29 megapixels, 6K oversampled 4K. And they no longer make cameras. Kinda sad. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. And as always, you can make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. See you guys later.